A cop crossed the line in broad daylight, humiliating a teenage girl. But when her father showed up, the fight for justice became unstoppable. The blue and red lights flared behind her, casting streaks of color across the empty road. Mikayla Dawson gripped the steering wheel, her heart hammering. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. Her hands were at 10 and 2, just like her dad had taught her. Be polite. Keep your hands visible. Don't give them a reason. She rolled down the window as Officer Janine Caldwell approached, the tap of her boots echoing on the pavement. Janine didn't bother with a greeting. License and registration. Mikayla swallowed. I wasn't speeding. I didn't ask for a debate. Janine cut her off, her eyes hard. Hand it over. Mikayla exhaled slowly and reached toward the glove compartment, moving deliberately. She could feel Janine's stare drilling into her. The air felt thick. She handed over the documents with steady hands, but inside, she was shaking. Janine snatched them and glanced at the license. 15, huh? Where you coming from? My friend's house. Uh-huh. Step out of the car. Mikayla hesitated. Why? Janine's lips curled. Step. Out. The edge in her voice sent a cold wave through Mikayla's body. She pushed the door open, stepping onto the asphalt. The air smelled like hot pavement, and something burnt in the distance. Janine circled her like a vulture, inspecting, sizing her up. You got something in your pockets? No. You sure? Yes, ma'am. Janine smirked like she didn't believe her. Turn around. Mikayla obeyed, biting her lip as Janine patted her down, hands pressing into her jacket, her jeans. Nothing. Janine exhaled through her nose, disappointed. What's in the car? My backpack, my phone, some gum. That's it. Janine peered inside the vehicle, shining her flashlight along the seats. Her gaze landed on Mikayla's long, thick curls, pulled into a loose ponytail. You carrying anything in your hair? Mikayla's stomach turned. What? Janine tilted her head. It's a lot of hair. Mikayla took a step back. It's just my hair. Janine didn't like that. Her expression shifted into something colder, more dangerous. Turn around, she ordered. No. That single word cracked the air like thunder. Janine's face twisted. She reached for her belt, but not for her gun. For the scissors attached to her vest. Before Mikayla could react, Janine grabbed a fistful of her curls and sliced through them in one jagged motion. Gasps rang out from a small crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk. A man pulled out his phone, recording. Mikayla stumbled backward, gripping what was left of her hair, shock swallowing her whole. Janine held up the severed curls like a prize. Now we'll see if you're hiding something. Mikayla's breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. Her scalp burned where Janine had yanked. A woman in the crowd shouted, You can't do that! Another voice, angrier. That's assault! Janine's smirk faltered. She looked around, suddenly aware of the eyes on her. Mikayla's pulse thundered in her ears. She wasn't sure if it was rage, humiliation, or both. This couldn't be real, but it was. And it wasn't over yet, because someone had just uploaded the video. Mikayla sat on the curb, legs pulled up, arms wrapped around herself. She couldn't bring herself to touch her hair again. The weight of it, the length, the curls, the part of her that had always been hers, was gone, left in the hands of a cop who had smirked as she did it. A woman knelt beside her, speaking softly. Sweetheart. What's your name? Mikayla barely heard her. Her ears rang with the sounds of the crowd, voices rising, phones buzzing, someone cursing under their breath. A man was still recording, zooming in on Janine, who had stepped away, hand twitching near her belt. The bravado was gone now. She knew. She knew people had seen. Janine turned to her patrol car and grabbed the radio. I need a supervisor at my location. Her voice was calm, controlled, like this was nothing more than a formality. The woman next to Mikayla looked up sharply. Yeah, you do. Mikayla blinked, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands clenched in her lap. She would not cry, not here, not in front of her. A voice cut through the air. Oh, hell no! Mikayla looked up. A teenage boy, no older than 17, was staring at his phone, his face twisted in disbelief. She's already gone viral. The murmurs around them grew. People pulled out their phones, checking their notifications, watching, refreshing. And then came the sound that changed everything. A notification chime, over and over again. The video was spreading. Janine must have heard it too, because her shoulders went rigid. She turned slowly, scanning the growing crowd. Some were watching her, but most were watching their screens. Mikayla's stomach twisted. "Sweetheart," the woman said again, this time firmer. "Do you have someone you can call?" Mikayla swallowed hard. "My dad." The woman nodded. "Do you want me to call him for you?" Mikayla hesitated, but only for a second. She pulled her phone from her jacket pocket, her fingers trembling as she pressed the contact. Her father answered on the first ring. "Hey, baby girl." His voice was warm, steady. The same voice that had read her bedtime stories, helped with math homework, cheered the loudest at her basketball games. The same voice that made her feel safe. Hearing it now nearly shattered her. Her throat closed. She couldn't speak. "Mikayla?" His tone shifted. Alert. Concerned. The woman took the phone gently from her hands. "Sir, my name is Tasha Simmons. I'm here with your daughter. You need to come to..." She glanced at the nearest street sign. "Martin Luther King Drive and Jefferson. Right now." A pause. Then a question. "What happened to my daughter?" Tasha's jaw tightened. She looked at Mikayla, then at the severed curls still lying on the pavement. When she spoke, her voice was ice. "She was assaulted by a police officer." Silence. Then, "I'm on my way." Tasha hung up and handed the phone back. "He's coming, baby." Mikayla nodded weakly. Janine stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her gaze flicking between the crowd and the street, as if waiting for backup. But the police weren't the only ones coming. Because the man behind that phone call, he wasn't just some concerned parent. 15 minutes. That's all it took. The sound of tires screeching against pavement shattered the thick tension hanging over the scene. A sleek, dark-colored SUV came to an abrupt stop near the curb. The door swung open before the vehicle had fully settled. And then he stepped out. Dominic Warren. Even if people didn't recognize him on sight, the way the crowd shifted, murmured, parted, spoke volumes. This wasn't just some man rushing to his daughter's side. This was a name, a force. 6'3", broad shoulders, sharp suit that looked like he'd walked out of a courtroom just hours ago. His presence alone felt like the temperature had dropped, the kind of cold that made people stiffen in place. Janine saw him, and for the first time that night, she hesitated. "Baby." Dominic's voice softened as he crouched in front of Mikayla, scanning her face. His hands found hers, strong and grounding. "Are you okay?" Mikayla opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She had held it together up until now. But suddenly, the weight of it all, the shame, the rage, the way Janine had violated her, pushed against her ribs so hard she thought she might collapse. Tears welled. Her hands trembled. Dominic saw everything. His jaw flexed, his grip tightening ever so slightly, like he was absorbing every ounce of her pain and turning it into something dangerous. And then, his eyes cut to Janine. The shift in his expression was subtle but deadly. "What's your badge number?" His voice was calm, controlled. The kind of control that made people nervous. Janine lifted her chin, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. She knew who he was now. "This is an active investigation," she replied stiffly. "I'm waiting for my supervisor." "That's not what I asked." Dominic's voice never rose, but the weight of it made the air feel heavier. "Badge number." Janine squared her shoulders. "Sir, I need you to step back." Wrong answer. Because at that exact moment, 2 more cars pulled up. One unmarked, the other clearly marked as a police supervisor's vehicle. A black man in a crisp lieutenant's uniform stepped out, eyes already locked on Dominic before flicking to Janine. His entire demeanor changed when he saw Mikayla. His gaze dipped to the scattered curls on the pavement. He inhaled sharply. "Officer Caldwell." His voice was tight, measured. "What the hell happened here?" Janine opened her mouth, but Dominic beat her to it. "I'll tell you what happened," he said, rising to his full height. "Your officer unlawfully detained my daughter, physically assaulted her, and mutilated her hair, all while being recorded. I'd say that's a problem. Wouldn't you? A ripple of tension spread through the growing crowd. People were still filming. Whispers turned into full conversations. Janine finally looked nervous. "Lieutenant," she started. But the older officer held up a hand. "Not another word, Caldwell." His eyes shifted back to Dominic. "Mr. Warren, I know who you are." Dominic's expression didn't change. "Then you already know how this ends." Silence stretched. Janine wasn't untouchable anymore, because Dominic wasn't just a father. He was the man people called when cops like Janine thought they could get away with anything. Janine Caldwell had spent over a decade getting away with things like this. A rough shove here, an unnecessary search there, just enough force to remind people who was in control, but never enough to stick. But this was different. She could feel it in the way Lieutenant Eric Dawson, a man she had worked under for years, wouldn't even look at her. The way the crowd didn't just watch, but documented every second. The way Dominic Warren stood with the kind of silence that was louder than a scream. The lieutenant exhaled sharply, his fingers pressing into his temples, like he could already see the nightmare unfolding ahead. "Caldwell, turn in your badge and weapon. Right now." Janine's head snapped toward him. "Sir, That wasn't a request." His voice left no room for argument. For the first time in her career, Janine felt small. She was used to barking orders, used to controlling the narrative, but standing there, with her badge stripped from her chest, her gun pulled from its holster, and her name being dragged across social media in real time, she realized something. No one was coming to save her. The lieutenant turned to Dominic. "Mr. Warren, I need to take your statement. Your daughter's too." Mikayla stiffened at the mention of her name. The weight of what happened still sat heavy on her chest, but she nodded. She wanted this on record. Dominic put a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "We'll be filing charges," he said smoothly, voice unwavering. "And not just against her." The lieutenant hesitated. "Meaning?" Dominic tilted his head. "How many complaints does she have on file?" A flash of discomfort crossed the lieutenant's face. Janine swallowed. Because she knew. She knew there were reports, plenty of them. But she also knew how many times those complaints had been quietly dismissed, buried under excuses, ignored because she was just doing her job. But that wasn't going to happen this time. Because Dominic Warren wasn't just asking a question, he was building a case right in front of her. The lieutenant exhaled. "I'll need to check." "You do that," Dominic said. "Because if we find out you've been protecting her, if we find out there's been a pattern of abuse that your department let slide, we'll take this far beyond a civil case." Janine's stomach twisted. A woman in the crowd muttered. She thought she could get away with it. A man next to her scoffed. She thought wrong. For the first time in her life, Janine Caldwell knew what it felt like to have no power. And the worst part? This was just the beginning. The footage was everywhere. By morning, it had been shared across social media, picked up by news outlets, and dissected by legal analysts. A white officer cutting off a black girl's hair during a traffic stop? It wasn't just a case, it was a firestorm. Cable news anchors debated on split screens. Civil rights activists called for Janine's immediate arrest. The hashtag #HeartJusticeForMikayla trended nationwide. And then came the lawsuits. Dominic Warren wasted no time. By noon, he stood in front of a row of microphones, Mikayla by his side, her head held high despite the uneven patches where her curls had been butchered. "My daughter was humiliated, assaulted, and dehumanized by someone who was supposed to protect and serve." Dominic's voice carried through the crowd, measured but razor sharp. "But this is bigger than one officer. This is about every black child who has ever been made to feel small under the weight of a badge." Mikayla swallowed hard. She had never seen her father like this before. Not just angry, but focused. A controlled, lethal kind of rage. He turned to the cameras. "We are filing a lawsuit not only against Janine Caldwell, but against the department that protected her. We will be demanding a full investigation into every complaint that was ever dismissed, ignored, or swept under the rug." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "And I promise you," he continued, his voice dropping into something quieter, heavier, "every single person who allowed this to happen will be held accountable." A reporter raised a hand. "Mr. Warren, have you heard from Officer Caldwell?" Dominic barely blinked. She has nothing to say that I need to hear. But Janine did have something to say. Her lawyer, a stiff-looking man with silver hair and a cheap suit, held a press conference of his own later that day. My client deeply regrets the events that transpired, he said, reading from a prepared statement. She was acting within her duty as an officer, and the reporters weren't buying it. Cutting off a child's hair is within her duty? What about the past complaints? Has Officer Caldwell apologized to Mikayla Dawson? Janine stayed silent, her jaw locked, eyes downcast. Because she knew no apology was going to fix this. And the worst part? This wasn't even over yet. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, community members, all crammed into the wooden benches, waiting to hear what they already knew was coming. The air buzzed with tension, cameras flashing as the judge called the court to order. Janine Caldwell sat stiffly at the defendant's table, her lawyer whispering something in her ear. She barely nodded. For the first time in her career, she wasn't in control. Across the room, Mikayla sat beside her father, shoulders squared, head high. The prosecution laid it all out. The video, the excessive force complaints, the testimonies from others who had crossed paths with Janine and walked away bruised, humiliated, or too afraid to report what happened. It was a pattern that had finally caught up with her. When the judge spoke, his voice was firm. Officer Caldwell's actions were not only excessive, but egregiously abusive of her position. Law enforcement does not exist to degrade or dehumanize those it is sworn to protect. Mikayla held her breath. Then, the words that would change everything. I am recommending full termination from the police force, effective immediately, with additional charges to be determined by the district attorney's office. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others just sighed, like they had been waiting for this moment for years. Janine? She sat frozen, staring straight ahead, as if she couldn't believe it was actually happening. But it was. Outside, a sea of reporters swarmed as Mikayla and Dominic stepped onto the courthouse steps. The cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in their faces, but Dominic held up a hand. Mikayla took a breath, and then she spoke. What happened to me should have never happened to anyone. Her voice was strong, even as emotion wavered at the edges, but it did. And it happens all the time, to people who don't have a video, or a lawyer for a dad, or a crowd of people willing to fight for them. She glanced at her father. His expression was unreadable, but she could feel his pride, his strength standing beside her. She turned back to the cameras. This fight isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been treated like they don't matter. And if this can happen to me, imagine how many other people have gone through the same thing with no one to stand up for them. She swallowed hard. So if you see something, say something. Don't stop recording. Don't stop fighting. Don't stop demanding better. The crowd erupted again, but this time it wasn't just noise. It was a wave, a shift, a moment that wouldn't be forgotten. And for the first time since that awful night, Mikayla felt like she had taken something back. Her voice, her power. And this time, no one was taking it from her again. If this story moved you, if it made you think, share it. Keep talking about it. Keep pushing for change. Because silence is how injustice survives. Let's make sure this never happens again.